This is part 2 of a metaphysical demonstration of the existence of God. The conclusion of part 1 was that the world requires an explanation, even if we don't know what that explanation is. That there is an answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And let me make a note to say that when we ask why, we're simply asking for an explanation. We're not necessarily asking for like a meaning or a purpose. Other people may be asking for those sorts of things when they ask the question, but for our purposes, we're just not concerned with that. The conclusion of part 2 will be that even if the world had always existed, it nevertheless still requires an explanation, and that it cannot explain itself. I'll note once more that when I say world, that can be a universe or multiverse or an infinite series of expanding, contracting universes, almost anything you like. The particular scientific details are not really relevant to the argument because the argument would work regardless. So one of the objections we left off with was that the world could simply lack an explanation if it had always existed. Now, this can sound compelling on the face of it, but I don't think it works because notice how the principle of sufficient reason does not draw any distinction between things that began to exist or things that always existed. As far as the principle is concerned, either one of those would require an explanation. The principle simply says there is a sufficient reason for the being of whatever is and for all attributes of any being. And so regardless of whether it began to exist or always existed, it would still require an explanation. Now certainly one may object to that principle, but they would have to respond to the case that was made for it before they could say, well, perhaps something might lack an explanation. As far as I'm concerned, that sort of objection would have been ruled out once we've established the principle of sufficient reason. And not to mention, if someone is able to undermine the principle of sufficient reason, then you wouldn't even have to say that the world had always existed and that's why it doesn't need an explanation. If things don't require explanations, then who cares if it began to exist or always existed? We could just say it doesn't have an explanation. So here's an analogy that I wrote a while back, which I think makes my overall point on this much more intuitive, and I'll spare you the dramatic reading this time. So, imagine you're scheduled to give a lecture tomorrow, but you do not have any of your notes prepared. Well, fear not, for you have a time machine. And at the depths of your despair, what should you see but a time portal open up, and out comes the future you with all the notes you need, beautifully handwritten on the topic of how the Catholic Church only exists to ruin everybody's fun. Future you hands you the notes and steps back into the time portal. And then the next day you give your lecture just as scheduled, and after giving the lecture you then go home and step into your time machine to give the lecture notes to the past you, repeating all the words and actions done by the future you that handed you the notes, because everything you experienced secondhand you are now experiencing firsthand, because now that future you is you, and the process is thus repeated. Okay, now here's the question. Whose handwriting were the notes written in? You might be tempted to say it was your handwriting. I mean, after all, it was your lecture, but I don't know if you can say that because you never actually wrote the notes, because they simply always existed. Another question, why was it on the topic of how the Catholic Church ruins everybody's fun? Could you appeal to your deep anti-religious motives? Well, no, because again, you didn't actually write the notes, because they always existed. And so similar to the analogy we gave in part 1 with the two identical objects where one was heavier than the other, this seems to be another kind of scenario that we just intuitively want to reject as being unintelligible. And so it would seem that even if something could have always existed, it doesn't follow from that it could simply lack an explanation. The other objection said that if the world had always existed, then it would be able to explain its own existence. Now, I've already laid out the details to this objection in part 1. The way I answer this is by using an analogy we get from the philosopher Leibniz, and here is how that goes. Imagine you have a geometry textbook, and the information in the textbook was copied over from a previous textbook, and the information in that book was copied from a previous one, and so on and so forth. And so what we have is an infinite number of geometry textbooks going back into the past forever. And so when we ask, where did the information in this book come from, we can just point to a previous book and say it came from that book. And if we want to ask the question of that book, we can give the same sort of answer. It came from a previous book. Have you noticed a problem here, though? I mean, one problem is that I should have had the forethought to get a whiteboard for this video, but the other problem is that it doesn't really answer the question of where did this information come from. Because think about this, why is this infinite series of books geometry books? Why not something else? Why not poetry or a novel or science? Why is it geometry? Or why does this series even exist at all? These are questions which cannot be answered by simply pointing to some book in the series or even pointing to the entire series itself. And likewise, when we ask questions like why is there something rather than nothing, that can't be answered by simply pointing to something in the world or even the entire world itself, even if it's always existed and gone back into the past forever, because it could have been different. So why is the world that's always existed the way it is and not some other way? And that brings us to our next principle, which we're going to call the principle of selection. And it says, if something could have been otherwise, then it cannot explain itself. Here's one more analogy to illustrate this point. Okay, I'll try to make this one quick. Imagine one day you discover that you're a clone of somebody else, and then you go track down that clone and you find out that that person is actually also a clone of someone else. So you're actually a clone of a clone. I'll just spare you the details. So we have an infinite number of clones going back into the past forever. So you are actually a clone of a clone of a clone, and that just goes on forever. So the question is, why do you have the particular DNA you have rather than some other DNA? Why do you have the eye color you have as opposed to some different color? You get the idea. And so even if we're able to give an approximate explanation for each thing in the series, we still haven't explained the series itself, because if it could have been otherwise, it cannot explain itself. Okay, so let's back up and just start from the beginning, and I'll tell you where we're at right now. There is a sufficient reason for the being of whatever is and for all attributes of any being. The world has being, that is to say, the world exists. Therefore, the world requires an explanation, even if it has always existed. If the world is unable to explain its own existence, then the explanation must be found in something not of the world. The world is unable to explain its own existence. Therefore, the explanation must be found in something not of the world. So I haven't really defended that fourth premise yet, but we're going to go more into that in part 3, where I introduce our final-ish principle. Also, this may be another point where some might be tempted to accuse me of some kind of God of the gaps or argument from ignorance, in which case I'll point out again that I have not said that God is the explanation. We still have one more part, so I will see you in part 3.
In order to explain what this analysis by principles is, maybe the best way to do it is to actually jump into
So does anyone ever feel like these analogies just make things more complicated?
And you can start to see, yeah, this is not like analysis into elements. This is a different kind of thinking that's going on.